Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Today, we have joining us Dr. Sandeep Jauhar, and he is a doctor, but has also written a book called My Father's Brain. And any of us going through this journey of dementia with a loved one, it really struck, I know, a lot of chords, at least with myself, on my journey with my mom. So we're very excited to have him with us. Welcome, Sandeep. Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying our video. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Click on the link below to get access to our interactive video on the 7 stages of Alzheimer's. Now, back to our interview.
Thank you, Deborah.
Okay, so I think the thing, to be very honest and frank with you, that occurred to me while reading your book, the number one thing was that you are a doctor. However, you have the same exact struggles that I have. And in some way, that was really comforting to me. And I don't mean that disrespectfully at all, but it was real and it felt really real. So start by telling us a little bit, just for those of you, who are watching who haven't read My Father's Brain yet, tell us why you decided to write this book.
Wow. Well, I never planned on writing a book about my father's and my journey through my father's illness. I just found that when he was diagnosed, I was just flailing. I was always very close to my father. It was very difficult to watch him decline. But, as a doctor, I must confess that at least in the early stages of his illness, I didn't really know what was happening. I went to medical school. I did a residency in internal medicine. I'm a cardiologist. I did rotations on the neurology wards. I've had many patients with dementia, but when I was faced with the prospect of caregiving, I found that I went through all the stages, the denial, the frustration, that many people do, the anger. And I think a lot of it was because I was ill-informed about dementia.
Well, I honestly think what was occurring to me as I was reading it is, this is the stuff they don't teach you in medical school, right? It's
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was a humanity about it that really, really hit home with me, because as you discussed some of the struggles you had and how your relationship changed with your dad, it's exactly the story of so many other people. And one of the things that you do so well is you talk about behavior and you relate it back to the brain, which I really love, because I think in that sense, that's where we have more empathy, when we can really understand why these behaviors are happening. We become more empathetic. And I felt that was very much captured with your father.
I think you just hit the nail on the head for my motivation for writing the book, which is that I went through periods of frustration, mostly because I didn't know what was going on. And so I didn't initially intend to write this book, but I did intend to learn as much as I could about my father's illness, to inform my caregiving, to give me patience when I needed to have, when he needed me to be patient. And so I wrote what I think is kind of, well, it's a sort of wrenching personal chronicle. I mean, everyone knows how difficult it is to care for someone with dementia, but I also wanted to write a neurological script. What is going on in the brain? Why, for example, could my father not remember what he had for lunch, but he remembered the partition of India when he was a boy? What's going on in the brain? Why? What is memory? What does memory mean? I mean, I explore that sort of the cultural and metaphorical and sort of personal meanings, family meaning, all that, but also like the sort of neuroscience of memory. And that was really important for me as a doctor, but also as a son, to understand what was happening. Why did my father become emotionally volatile when he'd been the most mild-mannered person? Well, turns out, as you know, that the amygdala, which processes emotions, is right next to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus processes memory. Memory is often the first thing to go. And then emotional volatility occurs. And then the loss of self-awareness. And I sort of mapped that out as a way to kind of tell caregivers, well, this is what to expect. And I think when you know what to expect, when you have a roadmap, you're more likely to be patient and loving and just a better caregiver.
Yeah, and I love how you kind of go. I definitely identified through the different phases, and looking at my mom, who my mom is still alive. Your dad unfortunately passed away. The different stages of that memory loss in the beginning, and then the more emotional situations that you deal with. Those I find, just like I could really relate, we lose patience. It's almost like the memory, like once you have the emotional stuff, the memory stuff seems a little bit easier, right? It's like,
Yeah.
so you forget things all the time, but I can't deal with this anger. I can't deal with like this irrationality. I can't. And we should back up for our audience a little bit and tell them you were dealing with a mom with Parkinson's and a dad who had later got dementia. But I found that comparison enormously helpful, again, because they're both neurological conditions, right? And understanding that relationship that you had both with your mom and your dad. Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, because you were pretty much going, it seemed like you were going through, I mean, your dad was healthier until later. He had his dementia diagnosis after your mom was diagnosed with Parkinson's, right? Long
Absolutely,
after.
yeah.
So
So my mother was diagnosed in about 2009. Around 2012, 13, she was really declining, and her disease was also a brain disease, but Alzheimer's is sort of the emperor of brain diseases. Her disease was really manifested more in motor function, motor dysfunction. She couldn't walk. She had, she had some cognitive decline, but it wasn't really that palpable. So she was still aware of what was going on. Her memory was relatively intact. She could, for example, remember when she bought a piece of clothing, but didn't know how to put it on. Whereas my father's disease was the opposite. He couldn't remember when he had bought the suit, but he still retained sort of procedural memory, ability to dress himself. So their brain diseases were in very many ways complementary as they were, as people. My mother was very affable. My father was a little bit more reserved. My mother was very a contented person. My father was always striving and very ambitious. So yeah, I mean, their diseases were very different, but sort of originated in the same place, if you will. But so what started happening in 2012 is we knew my mother was declining. We wanted to move her and my father to New York, where my brother and I live. And this is probably a very familiar story for a lot of people. Is like, when you're far away from your parents and they're aging, you don't really know what's going on. We didn't really know what was going on. My mother was not really forthcoming about the fact that they were eating cereal for dinner, that that my father got lost on the way home from his laboratory. That was if I had known that, then that would have been a real red flag. So this is, unfortunately, I explore this in the book, that in America we used to live in multi-generational homes, and there was always someone around to help out. But the world has changed. Kids grow up and to blaze their own paths, like my brother and I and my sister did. Women work outside the home. These are really good developments. But you see when someone is declining and needs help, that's when you see how porous our social safety net is. And because the government provides so little care, the social safety net in America is really the family. And when the family is kind of splintered, and people have moved far away, it's hard to care. So we moved our parents to New York, and became abundantly clear from the outset that my father had a real problem. He couldn't remember the code to the safe that we bought for him. He was very kind of uh, uninvolved in the move and sort of making decisions, and he was sleeping a lot, and then he was getting lost in his new neighborhood. And so my mother one day finally said, we were on a walk, and she stopped me and said, "Do you think your dad has Alzheimer's?" And that was the first time anyone in the family, we were sort of in denial, that had even uttered those words, because there is still such a stigma associated with having Alzheimer's. And so we ended up taking my father to a neurologist, and he diagnosed him with mild cognitive impairment, which is sort of a pre-dementia. And that's kind of how the book starts, with him getting the diagnosis, and then sort of going through the very difficult journey, or the most difficult journey I've ever taken. And the goal is, as you pointed out, I wanted to provide a little bit of comfort. I wanted to write the book that I needed to have, that I didn't have when I was going on this journey. A book that explained the history and the science of dementia, that was a personal story, that sort of recapitulated the conversations and the scenes that so many families go through. And the hope was that it would sort of serve as a balm for people who are going down this road.
One of the things that struck me, similarities as well, is your relationship with your siblings. You have a sister and a brother, and who appear throughout the book. And, you're all debating what is the best thing to do at certain times, which is a very normal thing in a family, right?
Yeah.
And what that illustrated to me was how normal it is, because there's so many things you're fighting. You might not agree with your siblings, yet your father is not necessarily agreeing with you, and he's combative. And one of the things I kept thinking, and this happens to me often, is I've launched this website dedicated to brain health and dementia, and people often come to me and say, "What do I do about this problem?" And it's easy for me to tell them, but when I look inside my own family, it doesn't look so happy. It doesn't look like it's all together. And it was quite refreshing seeing that, given that two of you are doctors, that it's the same thing, and it really struck me. And the honesty that you put into this, because I would also think that, being a doctor, there's a certain amount of pride that we know what to do in the medical profession, but you were very honest about really not knowing. And, particularly how you spoke to your dad. And I remember struggling with this with my mom. And I remember when my mom was first diagnosed, I asked her, I said, "Do you want me to tell you the truth about how bad things are getting, or do you want me to pretend like you're doing, great?" And she said, "No, tell me, I want to know." But that changes significantly. So I tried that for a while, and that changes dramatically. And I saw that within your own story. You were really intent in telling your dad the truth, right? But it led to nothing, right? And so it's like
It led to anguish.
It led to anguish and arguments, and there's something about stepping into their reality that is so key to really, really helping. Tell me a little bit about what you learned on that journey, because obviously, when you were trying to convince him that things did happen, but he really believed it didn't happen, you weren't getting anywhere. So in hindsight, what did you learn?
Right. I mean, there's all fascinating questions. I mean, I wrote the book informed by my profession as a doctor, but I wrote it as a son and as a caregiver, and one who was flailing in many ways. So I wanted to be deeply honest about that. One of the things that I think a lot of caregivers sort of understand intuitively, and this is where my being a doctor maybe interfered with my caregiving or my optimal caregiving, is that caregivers sort of intuitively understand, look, there's a difference between lying to someone for your own benefit and for their benefit, right? And and telling the truth when it causes tremendous anguish isn't worth it. It actually doesn't give dignity. It actually takes away dignity. When I went on this journey, for me, as a doctor, right, I'm supposed to tell patients the truth. I don't withhold bad news. It's like that's the paradigm that we operate in modern medicine. And I try to apply that to my father. So when he would get angry that his caregiver was being paid, I would say, Dad, look, you know that people who work for you need to be paid. And that would make him very angry, and he would sort of kick her out of the house, and it created a lot of stress from my siblings. But I insisted. I said, for me, telling my father the truth was like telling him, you're still a part of my world, that you deserve to know the truth, that's the most dignified way I can treat you. And what I came to understand is that there's a different conception of dignity that is what you just said, is validating someone's reality, not causing them anguish and repeated anguish. My mother died in 2016. I was
going to just bring that up.
Yeah. And my father would say, as many, I'm sure people who are watching have experienced, he would say, where's your mother? And I would say, Dad, Mom died. She died 3 years ago, and nothing we say is going to bring her back. And, and then he would revisit it, and he would get very, very upset, emotional, so my brother said, we should just tell him that Mom is just not here. I said, that doesn't make any sense. Part of it was, I thought that, he was getting very paranoid at that time. He thought we weren't leveling with him about various things, about finances and so on. I said, if inevitably he's going to discover the truth, and then he's going to distrust us even further. But my brother would say things like, Mom's on a plane. And he'd say, well, can you call her? And he'd say, Dad, no, she's on the plane. You can't call someone on a plane, right? And he'd be like, oh yeah, that's fine. He said, well, make sure that you call her when she lands, and then he would be calm. And my brother sort of intuitively understood that, it wasn't worth it. And it wasn't just from a standpoint of stress. It was from a standpoint of caring. And so, in writing the book, I traveled the world, really. I mean, I traveled across the United States. I interviewed, a lot of caregivers. I went to a lot of support group meetings. And I traveled internationally. I went to a dementia village, the Hoogwijk in the Netherlands. And there, sort of their whole kind of basis for their caregiving is based on therapeutic deception. It's like creating this world that simulates a home, but it's not the person's home. And when I spoke to them and I said, isn't this kind of like unfair? Isn't this kind of deceptive? My guide said, in dementia care, you need to meet the person where they are and
step into their reality.
And I remember he said, Trump was the president at the time. He said, we validate Trump's reality all the time. Why can't we be as sympathetic to patients with dementia? Which I thought was great. But so I came to learn that my conceptions had to change to really be an effective caregiver. And I sort of traced that journey and that sort of psychological maturing, in the book.
The example in the Netherlands, one of my best friends, her in-laws have moved there, and they moved from Switzerland to Holland, and they actually rebuilt their apartment in Switzerland in the care home for them to live in. And it was brilliant because they actually understand that both of the parents have dementia, and they didn't understand that they moved out of their home. So it was like, just like coming home, and so that was an example of what you were talking about.
I mean, it's called reminiscence therapy, or, it goes by many different terms, but it sort of relies on the fact that we remember things at the seminal moments of our lives. Even patients with dementia do, because
Yeah.
long-term memories don't sit in the hippocampus where Alzheimer's starts. They sit in the sort of larger part of the brain called the cortex, which only gets affected later. So long-term memories, procedural memories, ability to dance, play the piano, remembering your wedding, your graduation from high school, going on camping trips with your parents. All these things tend to be retained in people, even in the latter stages of Alzheimer's. And so reminiscence therapy is a very effective way to remind the person of who they are.
So one of the things that occurred to me is I was reading your story and it was so much like mine. And it got me thinking about the brain and how, and you point this out in the book, how, towards the end, we kind of, we go back to kind of that infant stage where the children have to take care of the parents, and they get younger and younger, in terms of their abilities, language, everything. So, it occurred to me that the irony of all of this is, we mature when we're babies, we mature into individuals. We're all different people. We act differently, and then when we digress due to a dementia, the similarities are astounding. I mean, the behavioral similarities of what you went through with your dad are exactly the same as what I've gone through with my parent. And it got me thinking, why does degeneration, and I'm sure we don't know the answer to this, but why is it that we start to mimic the same behaviors when we've grown into individuals who are completely different and unique? It's almost like we kind of go back to a state that's very similar. And do we know in the brain, like what is going on that makes us actually more similar than more different when we're going through the phases of dementia?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, the short answer is we don't exactly know what happens, and the sequence with which neural circuits get obliterated. But it is true that in the very latter final stages of Alzheimer's, the skills and abilities that degenerate happen in sort of a reverse sequence to the way in which they developed as an infant. So, for example, some of the last things to go are the ability to swallow, the ability to smile, the ability to hold your head up. Those are some of the first things that develop in children, in infants. And so I think the idea is that even the most primitive cortical circuits in the brain, they sort of remain intact until the very, very end. And so, yeah, I mean, we sort of intuitively say that dementia is like a second childhood, or, and I mean, we say that in sometimes in a sort of a nasty way, right? Like we used to say about my father, he's like a child now. We said that in front of him, but the reality is that there are some sort of the brain development of a child tends to get reversed in the order in which it developed, but in the reversed fashion in the final stages of Alzheimer's. So yeah, I mean, it's fascinating exactly what happens in the brain, and one of my goals in writing the book was to write the personal story, but also to write about the history and science of dementia, because I think when you understand the science, you feel more empowered.
Absolutely. In retrospect, Sandeep, what would you have done differently? I mean, you're so honest about this journey, and all of us are guilty of some of the things that you're brave enough to admit, not particularly speaking to your dad in a nice way at times. We've all been there. We've all done that, like short of temper, trying to convince him that he's wrong. What in hindsight, like if you were to go through this journey all again, what are some of the things you would have changed?
I think I subscribe to sort of, because of my training or because of my sort of hyper rational way of being, that the paradigm that I sort of subscribe to, not explicitly, but just sort of, it was just part of me, was reality orientation. Right? That was the paradigm that caregivers for patients with dementia had adopted back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, really didn't start changing until maybe the 1980s. So reality orientation was the way to go. Now, more people understand that validation therapy is a better way, or some people call it therapeutic deception. I think I would have made that transition a lot sooner. In retrospect, I should have. I think I was still sort of, part of me just very irrationally thought that if I could get my father to just try harder to remember, to concentrate, he'd be able to, do some of the things that he was able to do. And so I would scold him, and I would, in a loving way, but that created a lot of stress for him. And so one of the things I definitely would have done differently is not try to correct him so much, not try to get him to see the error in what he was doing, and kind of accept him, as a person who had changed, but someone who was still my dad,
Yeah.
and someone whom I still loved. And it's hard to convey that love when you're trying to change someone back to what they used to be.
And I want to talk a little bit about his last days. At first, I want to ask you on an emotional level, because I feel like, and this is me being completely honest, I am the most scared of not my mom dying, but I'm scared I'm going to remember her as someone with Alzheimer's instead of the person who she was. That terrifies me more than her actually passing.
Mm.
So tell me a little bit about what, we should probably tell people exactly when he died and what it's been like afterwards for you.
Yeah. So my father had a very precipitous decline, and this is not unusual in dementia. We don't know exactly what caused the final decline. I mean, I took him out to lunch, and there was that scene where I took him to the house of dosas, and we were walking back, and it was raining, and he was still walking, and he was still eating, and then like 3 days later, he couldn't get out of bed, and we didn't know what had happened. Had he developed a UTI? Had he developed some other infection? Did he have COVID? This was sort of during the COVID, sort of the middle of the pandemic. I didn't know. Did he have pneumonia? So I wanted to sort of investigate as a doctor. But my brother, who's also a doctor, said, what are you trying to do? What is your goal here? And there was a lot, especially in that final chapter, a lot of sort of disagreement and trying to figure things out together. And ultimately, we decided, on hospice, and yeah, I mean, I think that I don't really remember, because it was such a difficult journey. I've put some of his latter stages of his decline out of my mind. I still think of him as, as my dad, as the one I relied on, the one, he was such a funny guy. He would say, and I remember, I would talk to him about, like, I don't know, girl troubles. I'd say, and he'd be like, don't worry. Worrying never helps. And please call me, because I'll constantly be worried. That sort of the thing. That was him, and so I remember those things more than I remember him in his decline. Maybe if the final stretch had been prolonged, it would be harder to do that. But his decline was very, very quick. And although it was fraught with a lot of ethical challenges for me, do we respect his wishes that when he wrote them, when he was a eminent geneticist, or do, where he said, I don't want any sort of extraordinary measures taken if I become very impaired. That made sense when he was 50, he wrote those words. But then now that he's almost 80 and he's sitting there and he doesn't seem that unhappy, I mean, there
That
were moments of
really
pleasure.
struck me. The
There were
same,
yeah.
yeah,
And,
because
and so,
yeah,
so maybe, maybe, maybe I was unhappier than he was. Dementia kind of like, it restricted his perspective and his like wants and needs and ambitions in a way that almost kept him happy, or at least like in some ways he was more content than when he was a ambitious scientist who was trying to get the plenary talk at the big worldwide conference, or he was trying to get recognition for his scientific discoveries, So, I mean, it was, yeah, it
that
was very
that was
complicated.
so relatable to me, because I remember having a conversation with my mom and she said, if I get really bad, I don't really want to live anymore. But your definition of, if you ask me to describe my mom today, I'd say, oh, she's content, So that definition severely changes, and it can't really be applied to how you and I are today, right? It's a new norm.
One of the big lessons I learned is that contentment and cognitive impairment aren't necessarily exclusive. And sometimes the thing that makes us the most unhappy is our cognitive, is the way we think about things.
Yeah.
So yeah, toward the latter stages of my father's life, I didn't really see him that unhappy. I think we were unhappier that he had become this way, that more than he was. And I think that sort of reflects what I write in the book, is this sort of hypercognitive prejudice that we have, especially in the West, or capitalist cultures in general, where what's really prized is productivity, the ability to process information. That's the sort of the centerpiece of our lives, right? I mean, with the smartphones and social media, everything, with constant influx of information. If you can't process that information, if you can't add to the conversation, then you become marginalized. And I think that's what happens a lot with dementia patients. They're not as unhappy as we are that they can't participate anymore in our lives.
That's so true. The last chapter really struck me, and I have a question that this is leading up to, but you and your brother are both doctors, and your dad stopped eating and he was becoming very dehydrated. And that's this debate. Do we give him an IV? Do we give him, do we sustain him into this life, or do we just let him? And, that scene really, because I could see what was unfolding within your family, you and your brother debating whether or not what was the right thing to do at that time, and what would dad want, right? That's very human. And you're both doctors. So I wanted to ask this question, now that you've been through this journey, if tomorrow somebody brought their loved one who was being diagnosed with dementia, how would it change the way that you interact with them now that you've been through this as a doctor?
I mean, look, most doctors don't want to deal with end-of-life issues. And I can't say I was any different. I'm a cardiologist, and we pride ourselves in cutting edge technology, innovations, therapies. I also do congestive heart failure. And so I see a lot of death. But like many of my colleagues, before I went down this, through this journey, when patients would get referred to hospice or palliative care, I would step back. I would say, well, there's really nothing more I can do. And what I realized, being the son of someone who was dying, is that it was really important for me that my father's doctor still remained engaged in with our family, and still sent text messages and sort of checked up on things. So I strive to do that, in my practice, much more than I ever did. But I'm not sure if your question was what kind of advice I would give to someone
I
who's,
mean, just as you practice, you kind of did answer it. It's like the
yeah,
little
I've
things,
changed.
the little things that you really, I mean, you're not going to change dementia right now. So it's those little things, checking up on maybe the more personal things that are going on with personality changes and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
Does mean a lot, it goes a long way. So I just want to tell everyone, if you haven't read My Father's Brain, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful, wonderful just recount of you and your family. And thank you, Sandeep, for being so honest and really sharing it with the world. I highly recommend it. We'll post a link on the comment section to My Father's Brain. But thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and thank you for what you do. I mean, this is so important. It really is. And now sort of being in this world, like you never leave it, having gone through this, and I just think that organizations like yours and others are just so important to provide support for people going down this journey, this road, because it's a really lonely road. It really
It,
is.
it is, and it's so much better with company.
Yeah, yeah.
So hopefully your book will provide that to a lot of people. Thanks again. And for our audience, to hear more about these talks, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter on beingpatient.com. That's where we let you know what the next talks are. This one was great. Thank you so much, Sandeep. All the best, and keep in touch.
Thank you.